Okay, in this video, we're going to be talking about graphing projects that involve different tasks or have multi-steps in order to go from start to finish. And if you'd like to follow along in our book, well, not necessarily follow along, but it's on page 153 if you would like some more explanation. So let's go ahead and get started. In this problem we're looking at right here, it asks us to draw a graph in the space provided to you. All right, so here's the situation here. This project or this task that we're going to graph has multiple steps. Notice that we have a start and we have a finish. This entire column here tells us all the different tasks that we have to do to go from start to finish. And what we're going to do is we're actually going to graph that information and just to kind of show and display all the different steps for this problem. Now, another thing that you will notice is, let me kind of clean this up a little bit, is that every task is always going to have the amount of time it takes to do the task, which in this case, we'll just label this 2 minutes. So task A, it takes to do 2 minutes, and it's always going to have a prerequisite, meaning what has to be completed first before the next task can begin. So like, for example, if we were to look at task B, just looking at it at random, task B takes 4 minutes to complete, and in order for task B to start, task A must be completed. Now, some of this may be a little confusing to hear, so once we start putting things on paper, hopefully it'll look a little better. All right, so let's go ahead and get started. The first thing we have to do is we have to graph a start, okay? And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to pull this S over here, and this is my starting point, S. Now, let me actually put start just so it's a little less confusing. So this is my start here, and that's where my graph is going to begin. Now notice as we move down our list here, the next thing is going to be A. And look at the prerequisite for A. That means there's no prerequisite for A. That means it can just go ahead and get started. So the way that we graph this is anything that ever has a prerequisite of none, the start is going to point to that task. So visually we see if this was the start, A can go ahead and get started. All right. And of course you might still be a little confused, so we're going to keep building and hopefully it'll kind of help you out. Let's look at B for a second. B has a prerequisite of A. Now to keep this really simple is if anything ever has a prerequisite, the prerequisite will be pointing to the task. So notice A will be pointing to B because A is a prerequisite. So what has to happen is that A is going to be pointing to B, like so. So in order for B to get started, A has to be completed. Now, depending on how observant you are, you'll notice that in each column, there is also a number. This was a 0, this was a 2, this was a 4. What are we going to do with those numbers? And this is very simple. The numbers that you see here will go on the arrow. Oops, let me redo that. The numbers that you see here will go on the arrow that is leading away from that particular task. So notice how start has a 0. That means the arrow leaving the start will have a 0 on it because that tells us the time it takes to do task A or the start. Okay. Notice that for task A, it takes 2 minutes to do this. See that 2 right here? So that means the arrow leaving A will have a 2 attached to it because this represents the time it takes to do task A, which is 2 minutes. All right? All right, let's kind of clean it up a little bit. We're now on task C. Notice that task C also has a prerequisite of A. Now remember how the prerequisites work. The prerequisites state that whatever the prerequisite is, it has to be pointing to C. So we already have an arrow from A pointing to B, but since C is another prerequisite, or that A is prerequisite of C. It's now going to spur off, and it's going to point to C, like so. Now you might be asking, well, what goes on this arrow here? Well, it is the time for A. So whenever there is a arrow leading away from a point on the graph, it's always going to have that particular time attached to it. So let's keep going. Now our next thing is D. Well, if you notice, D has a prerequisite of B. So that means I'm going to take an arrow spurred away from B and pointing to D here. Okay, now remember this arrow right here that I am going to highlight right now. This arrow, remember, is the arrow for B. So it is going to display the information for B, meaning the time for B. And I believe B's time was 4. So there we are. That's going to be a 4. Now we're at E. Well, if you look at E here, E has a prerequisite of C. So that means C is going to spur off or be pointing to E. And remember this arrow right here? That arrow represents the time it takes to do C, which the time it takes to do C was 4, because that was C's time. All right. Next one is F here. So F, which is right here, will be pointing from, or C is going to be pointing to F. So C is going to spur off here, and it's also going to be pointing to F. Now you might be asking Coach Ford, how are you going to draw all this out? Is there a set standard? There's really not, as long as all the connections are the exact same. All right, moving on. G to D. So that means D is prerequisite of G. So from G, let's see, is going to be here, and I'm going to put a G here. There we go. And that arrow from D is going to be labeled a 3. All right. Now this next one is going to be a little trickier in the sense of it now has 3 prerequisites, D, E, and F. So that means D, E, and F. So D, E, and F will all be pointing to H. Okay, now remember all these arrows need to have numbers attached to it, so that'll be a 3. Let's say E's time is a 2, and then F's time is a 1. Okay, and then we're going to keep going. Let's see, we're at I here. The prerequisite of I is G and H, and hopefully you're getting the concept at this point. G and H are going to be pointing to I. And remember, that's G's time. This is G's arrow, so that'll be a 2. H times will be a 5. And then lastly, notice that I is actually your very last task here until you get to finish. So we still need to graph the finish. So I will be pointing to the finish, which is right here. And so we got to put the time here. So there you have it. That's how you put it together, and that's how you graph everything. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to make another video showing another example of this, because we kind of went along with this. So if you have any questions, see part 2.